Cece has, oh, okay. So at this point, whoever is joining can just join directly, Cece. Is that where we are? Okay. We'll give it one more minute for people to join, and then we will start at 5 minutes after the hour. Okay, we're going to start. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jack Trope. I am a senior director in the Indian Child Welfare Program at Casey Family Programs, and this is a unique event, something we haven't done before. It's a joint event for both Casey employees and for the tribes with whom we have child welfare collaborative agreements. And so for the tribes, you'll know that this is part of a series that we have been doing with NDN Collective, an organization that you will learn about that can present for itself who they are. So I won't try to explain who NDN is, but for the tribes who have joined previous webinars, welcome back again for this particular event. It will be structured differently than the previous ones. It will be a panel format with questions and answers. For Casey employees who are joining, this is part of the recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day, and it's an educational event for Casey employees to learn about some of the challenges faced by Native communities. We're going to focus on one particular one, the dispute over the social studies curriculum in South Dakota, but I think hopefully there'll be some broader lessons that people can draw from the discussion and the presentations. And so with that, I will tell you that the format today is we're going to show you a little video about NDN. Then the CEO of NDN will introduce himself and sort of talk a little bit about their work. We will then have a panel discussion. It will be moderated by Fred Fisher, who many of you may know, a longtime Casey employee. He is now with the National Native Children's Trauma Network, Trauma Center. I think I finally got that right. And the panelists are, I will let them introduce themselves when we get to the panel, but they are some very distinguished people, both who work for NDN and also who are active in South Dakota. And so they will introduce themselves when we get to the panel. So with that, I'm going to ask Cece if she would cue up the video, and I'm going to turn it, then we'll turn it over to, and we'll let the program proceed. Oh, and also please mute if you're not on mute, please mute yourselves so that we don't have any background noise as we go through the panel. Thanks.
How long are you going to let other people decide the future for your children? Are you not warriors? We are unapologetically, unabashedly NDN. United like never before, we rise together, arm in arm, to equip all Indigenous people with the tools needed to become the architects of our future. Through a holistic approach to infrastructure, funding, capacity, movement building, and philanthropy, we are fostering a world of justice and equity for all people and the planet. If we want to transform the world, our vision has to be as great as the challenges we are faced with. It's not time to come from a place of fear. It's time to come from a place of power.
Nick, the floor is yours to introduce yourself and talk about NDN.
Hihani washte Hamadak Yapi, Nick Tilson, the Mach Yapi, Chantea washte Nape Chuzapolo. Good morning, everybody. My name is Nick Tilson. I'm the president, CEO, and founder of NDN Collective, Oglala Lakota. I'm actually calling in from Pai Jacinta, my home community here on Pine Ridge, and I'm father of 4, and just honored to be here. Really like this partnership and relationship that we have with Casey, and big shout outs to Fred Fisher and Anita Finde for continuing to see the importance of this value of this partnership, and to Michelle Fox and Robbie Burrows for continuing to keep us corralled in this work. And then of course you'll be able to hear from Sarah White, the director of our education equity team later, along with Dr. Sherry Johnson, about the amazing work that they're all doing around education equity, and fighting for Indian education for kids here in South Dakota and beyond too. Just briefly, when we created NDN Collective, we wanted to create something that would change the conditions in which Indigenous-led work was happening in this country. And when we looked at philanthropy, or the lack thereof philanthropy, it was an indicator that Native communities were going underinvested, with a less than 0.5% of philanthropy going to Native people. And then you've seen how that was basically a theme throughout the investments that you didn't see in Indian country, because if you took away Indian gaming, you took away extractive industries like the fossil fuel industry or uranium or these other things, there was little to no investment happening in Native communities. And then we were being blamed for the poverty that we have. Meanwhile, this whole country was built on Indigenous people's land. And so as a community organizer, because that's how I see the world, my title might be president and CEO, but I am at heart a community organizer. That's who I am. That's how I believe power gets built in the world, is by organizing people and resources. And wanted to create something, an ecosystem organization that could move grant dollars, that could move lending dollars, capacity building, community organizing, advocacy, and doing hands-on development work, and building an ecosystem organization that could do that. And a lot of the lessons learned from building NDN Collective came from community organizing and place-based development that I was doing in my home community on Pine Ridge at the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. But along with many of the members of the collective have brought in lived experience and practitioner-based experience to this organization, and now are helping to deploy different strategies in the communities that we work with. And so NDN Collective has NDN Collective has a grant making arm. To date, we have granted over $20 million to about 500 different Native communities, and support that work of defend, develop, decolonize, by investing into only Indigenous-led organizations. And so that's what we do in our grant-making arm. We also have the NDN Fund, which is a CDFI lending arm that provides access to capital. We go to Indian country and we go to the places that the banks don't go, invest into things that the banks don't invest into, things like sustainable solutions and regenerative agriculture and food systems and the development of schools, these different things. So that's what our lending arm does. And then we have a community organizing, advocacy, and action arm of the collective, because we recognize that we have to continue to organize and build power and build strategies that help us advocate for Native Indigenous people's rights, for land rights, for environmental justice, for education equity, for racial equity, racial justice. And so, we're one of these organizations that's a frontline community organizers, but we're happy to be grant makers, lenders, community developers, and we sort of have quite a bit going along in our own ecosystem here. We also operate our own social enterprises and engage in place-based community development in the places where we have roots right now. We're in the development of the Oshetishakoi Community Academy right there in Rapid City, Minneluzaha. We also are developing affordable housing there, helping support the unsheltered, and are on the front lines of many climate justice and racial justice strategies across this whole country. So, we're an ecosystem organization because we believe that the solution to challenging to facing the challenges that we're faced with today cannot be solved in silos, that they cannot be solved with one-off strategies, that in almost every single Indigenous language in the world, there is a word that recognizes the interconnectedness of all things in all places and all people. In Lakota, we say Madako Yase, which means that we're all related. But in every Indigenous language in the world that I've ever come in contact with, there's usually a word or a language or that says the same thing. And that tells us and informs us that we can't solve the world's problems in silos, that they're interconnected with one another. This is something I know that Casey understands deeply well. The Indian child welfare issue is deeply connected to poverty, is deeply connected to education, deeply connected to many of the systematic things happening in society today. And so those, that's a little bit about NDN Collective. You can learn more about what we're doing by following our platform that we've built on social media and our website and those things. You'll hear about the stances that our education equity team, members of the South Dakota Education Equity Coalition, have been taking on the active erasure of our people around curriculum, and how that and some of the strategies. So you hear more about that too. But I just wanted to take the few minutes here to thank Casey and everybody who is here to continue to engage in these conversations, in these hard conversations, as we work together to actively dismantle racism and white supremacy and build a new path forward for Indian country. And I'll leave by saying, this is something I think about often as a Native person, and it was harder to say when I first started saying it, but I feel it more now than I felt it before. And it's a question I pose to myself every day in the work that I do. And the big question is it possible? Is it actually possible that the best days of our people, our country, and our planet are actually in front of us and not behind us? And as a Native person, we tend to romanticize the past so just as much as non-Native people do. But I like posing that question because it invokes action, and it does create some opportunity to inspire and radically imagine a different future. And so as you enter into the rest of the conversations for the rest of the day, I'll leave you with that to pose the question, and the challenge is it possible that the best days of our people, our lands, our country, and our world are actually in front of us and not behind us? So there's no word for goodbye in Lakota. There's only Doksha Ake Wachiankikte, which means our paths will cross again. So I'm going to log off at this time, and you're going to be inspired by many of the things that are shared with you on this panel here today.
Thanks, Nick, for your words and for that vision of the future that's so positive. So with all of that, I will introduce our panelists, and we'll get started with the presentations today. So we have 4 distinguished panelists for you today. We have Dr. Johnson, Dr. Sherry Johnson, who's the Tribal Education Director for Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate. We have Sarah White, who is the Director of Education Equity for NDN Collective. We have Ross Garlick Bell, who is a member of the South Dakota Education Equity Coalition. And we also have Mary Bowman, who's a Native American Community Academy Inspired School Network Fellow at NDN Collective. And I'll begin with Dr. Sherry Johnson. Could you just introduce yourself to us and provide a little bit of background about your role as Tribal Education Director?
Certainly. I'm the Tribal Education Director at Sisseton Oyate, and we are located in the northeast corner of South Dakota. And I've been the Education Director here for going on 7 years now, so it's relatively new for our area. And my background really is in education. I was the past superintendent for 15 years at Enemy Swim Day School. And then prior to that, another 10 years, I was teaching at Teoshpazina Tribal School. So that's basically my background. And yeah, I'm here. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Johnson. Sarah, could you do the same? Tell us a little bit about yourself as a director, and then your role as Director of Education Equity at NDN Collective, a little bit about the South Dakota Education Equity Coalition and its vision for change, priorities, and some of the important milestones, perhaps.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Sarah White, and I'm the Director of Education Equity here at NDN Collective. I just want to preface by stating that the role of Ed Equity was initially brought into conception when we desired for school choice legislation in 2019. And then that led into the 2020 legislative session. But part of the organizing efforts that led up to that session was really convening a space for stakeholders and advocates to come together to promote that legislation, and that became known as the South Dakota Ed Equity Coalition. From there and following in consecutive legislative sessions, we've really become a convening space for education and non-education advocates who share the same desire in promoting prosperous outcomes for our students here in South Dakota, with a special interest in our Indigenous student populations. So we get to work with amazing people like the folks that you see on this call, as well as a host of others who feel really equally passionate about these efforts as well. And I will go ahead and drop some information into the chat about what the Ed Equity Coalition is and our website, and then we can move forward from there. But our biggest key initiatives right now is combating the anti-critical race theory propaganda that seems to be perpetuated by our state government, as well as promoting and combating the idea against Indigenous student erasure, and not just Indigenous student, but Indigenous culture, language, thought, and philosophy from our state content standards, which I know we'll talk about in great depth in a little bit. But it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Next, we have Ross Garlick Bell. Ross, do you want to talk a little bit about the political landscape and implications for educational equity, as well as introduce yourself to our attendees, I mean?
Well, good morning or good afternoon, I guess, depending on the time zone that you're in. My name is Ross Gerlich Bell. I am a member of the SDEC, and what I do is kind of analyze what the political environment is for activity for the coalition and looking at where there are opportunities for educational activities in order to inform the elected officials of what's available to them as far as different opportunities and programs. South Dakota is a little bit unique state. It has a supermajority that controls both chambers of the state legislature along with the governor. By supermajorities, the example would be the state Senate, where you have only 3 Democrats out of 35 Senate members. However, that doesn't mean that the minority party doesn't have a voice. They have had a very strong voice in talking and discussing issues before the entire body, and have been successful in seeing initiatives go forward. But that also brings in, there's the political that comes into every environment. And right now we're seeing the governor's race is starting to kick in for South Dakota. We're seeing redistricting that's taking an impact on what those districts will be looking like for the next session. We're also dealing with a state that does have term limits. And so several of those primary advocates for issues that SDEC is watching are going to be term limited out. And so they'll be finding those new representatives. Several of the committees that are key to looking at education issues in particular do not have representation from the communities in which SDEC is advocating for, which has created another difficult environment as far as educating on the perspectives that are needed in order to get the right choices made. But the coalition has done a good job in starting to address those difficult questions coming up and working with those members and broadening the support within the bodies. You'll see in the coming session coming up here, a lot of activity will be focused on the governor's race and challenges to the governor. You'll also see critical race theory coming up as a discussion item. The governor is very much in trying to look at the national political scene and seeing where she can direct South Dakota to go in order to benefit the national agendas. And that's where you saw the push with the recent education activities of the 1776 Commission that was advocated for under President Trump. She's now going after critical race theory. I just saw a post that the universities now are getting rid of the diversity label for the programs. Anything that looks like it's the opposite party is the actions the governor will take to stop. And so the coalition's big push will be to show that the issues that are important to the coalition members will be bipartisan, and make an effort to address with the bodies of why it's good for all South Dakotans to see the education equity move forward.
Thank you, Ross. Mary Bowman, could you do the same? Introduce yourself, talk a little bit about NISN, its partnership with the NDN Collective, and progress that you have made or the organization has made to design a curriculum and to fund a charter school in Rapid City.
Yes, thank you for having me. Ampeti washte Pakiapi Chante washte Anape Chiusapi, Mary Bowman Imachepi. I am a NACA Inspired Schools Network Fellow, and NACA is the Native American Community Academy in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and they had the first Indigenous community-based school, opened about 15 years ago, and a lot of communities, Indigenous communities, will come and see the school and want to know how they could have a school like that in their area. So they began a fellowship, and they have a network of schools. There are currently 9 schools in the network. And this coming fall, there will be 5 more schools added to that network, including our school here in Rapid City, the Ocheti Shakoi Community Academy, which is housed by NDN. And the fellowship is a 2-year fellowship. So the first year is planning, and the second year is implementation. So we are deep into the implementation portion of the fellowship. And then, of course, with our opening this fall, we don't have charter school legislation in South Dakota. That is one of the things that Sarah and Ross talked about that we are working on trying to get passed in South Dakota. So we are opening privately. It'll be privately funded, and we are opening 1 class, and we'll add a grade each year. And we're starting with kindergarten, and we'll have 2 classes of 20. So we'll open with 40 students and then add a grade each year till we have a fully operational K through 12 school. We'll be in a temporary space until our school is built. And so that we're probably looking at like 2 years of being in a temporary space. Just a little bit of our information about our local school district here. 30% of the population is Indigenous, and I worked for 15 years in our local school district. And as long as I've been here, even I would say back to when my father attended the same school district, we've always had the problem of low graduation rates, you know, wide achievement gaps, and an unproportionate representation in the discipline matrix. So culturally responsive teaching is something that really helps to close that achievement gap, but more importantly, it really offers a sense of belonging and strong cultural identity, which is, you know, when you know who you are and where you come from, that really gives you a positive, bright future and outlook, you know, where you want to go. So those are all things. Our school mission is that, you know, we are grounded in the language, the culture, the thought, and the philosophy of the Ocheti Shakoi people, which are the people who walked first here in this area. They were the 7 council fires people. That's the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. So our effort is just to have language and culture in the whole school, and even in the designing process and developing of the building itself is really grounded in the thought and the philosophy of the Ocheti Shakoi, the environment, and then of course the curriculum will be grounded in the thought and the philosophy of the Ocheti Shakoi people.
Thank you very much, Mary. So Dr. Johnson, I'll start with you with sort of an overview. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges that tribal nations have faced historically and that you currently face in working with the state of South Dakota on a government-to-government basis?
Okay, just dealing with consultation issues and things like that, education and more comes about. I really will address just that portion of it. I think later on I have time to talk about the standards. And so it was about, I think it was like in 2016 that the state finally put a call out to develop any kind of consultation. Otherwise, prior to that, there wasn't anything at all for it, especially in education. And so they put that call out. And so the tribal education directors that were available at that point in time got together and made a series of trips. You know, it took about a year to really get the consultation document on board. And it's uploaded on the South Dakota website now. And just under South Dakota tribal consultation document, I think you can find it. And that was the development of that. That's the first time that there has been anything as far as a tribal state level that I know about. Now, previous, there's supposed to be the Office of Tribal State Relations that bridge that difference, but I'm just not seeing anything coming in and out of that office for tribal consultation. And then really the whole gamut of tribal consultation is supposed to be a two-way communication back and forth. And if you look at the education portion of it, it really has to deal a lot with the title programs because it's mandated federally through the ESSA. And so they specifically deal with that consultation. Well, really the tribes aren't on board at the beginning. They're supposed to be on board during the planning, be able to provide input, be able to provide other avenues of resources and things for our education system. And really we're not on board. Basically the consultation is this is what the program is and this is what we've done. And the rest of it is even when we come to the state. Now, the last tribal consultation meeting we've had with the state of South Dakota was in 2019, and we haven't had one since. We do have a staff that has been tasked with keeping at least the education directors in information, and that's Joe Morin. And so he does a good job, but he's not the forefront of up in face planning, upfront planning. And as far as when we go to a lot of it deals with the local education agencies, which are technically our school districts. And that communication is pretty much the same way. They always talk about, you need to have input and you need to do things, be in the planning portion of this for tribes and to provide some input into those planning documents. And that's really not what happens. It's basically, this is what the program is, and this is how it runs. And so we've had a few instances, a few run-ins with one of our local school districts, and the first time they just said, well, our board's going to approve it anyway, regardless of what you don't like. And so, and they did, they just approved it. So, I was very upset at that point in time, but we got through that, and we worked through that with our public school district with a series of meetings and a series of how do we get past that and how do we do that differently. And so now this year, when it came the same time to do that information gathering and everything, there truly was a time where a parent came forward, provided some input and stuff, and the board says, we will take that in consideration and meet on this month, and we will come back for a decision and the impacts for the policies and everything for the following meeting, which was awesome, because then they really did take that parent some suggestions, but also provided a response to her on if they couldn't take her suggestions, why, what was the reasoning, or how can they do it a little bit differently. So I was very, very much embraced that, because that's the first time it's happened. So as far as consultation going back and forth in that government to government basis, I'm not sure it really happens. We're still being dictated to. There's still that area of concern that I have, and I've read the president's, what does he call this? His executive order on White House initiative. And I look all through that, and it talks about the self-determination, education equity, how they're going to strengthen it, and furthering tribal sovereignty and robust consultation. And I'm still wondering how that's all going to be done, but going to hold him to that and his cabinet to that, because also he talks about collection of a study, a collection information on published reports on education of American Indian students. So I want to see what that looks like. And so, is it happening? Is it effective? It might be happening. In some places it is, in some tribes it is, in some tribes it's not. And it should be. Even when we deal with when we go in a wider area and talk with our federal government and even our Bureau of Indian Educations, we're still kind of getting talked down to. And this is, all these decisions are already made, and this is how it's going to happen. So thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Johnson. My follow-up question to you then is that, could you elaborate a little bit on the curriculum itself that you've been working on? How was it developed? Who was part of the task force? And then the last part of the question is, what has any part of the curriculum being currently included as part of the proposed South Dakota social studies standards at all?
Okay, first of all, we don't have a curriculum. Curriculums are really at a local decision or a local decision. Our school boards usually designate and approve the curriculum. What we're talking here is our standards. So our state is responsible for adopting those standards that we teach our children. So that was one of the things about this, is really it's our Oceti Shakoi essential understandings that we're talking about. And our understandings are just a guiding document, but it's the only official document that our state of South Dakota has endorsed or has supported and actually developed. And it was developed from many numerous years, and it's updated too. And so of our Native people from the different reservations coming together. Is it perfect? No. Is it there? Yes. And it's a good starting point for any local school to go with is that. The problem with it is as a essential understanding, it's not mandated. And so as a result, you get the whole document and then you can put it on the shelf because it's just not mandated. And where we see most of our emphasis of Indian education is our 4th grade standards has our South Dakota history, South Dakota social studies standards are in 4th grade. So South Dakota is really taught then. And amongst, every year they get something, but right there, that's the whole focus. And then again is 8th grade social studies. And when you go and look in our history books, and you can pull any grade level at all, you can find where there is a 1-line mention of Native Indigenous people, and then when Columbus discovered us, so then that's in there, and then we fade from history. You don't see us again until there's the next war. We only surface at the war times that I can really determine. And as a result, our children are not taught Indigenous history, Indigenous, any of it, any of the intricacies of being Native, because a Native person will have to walk in 2 worlds. We have to abide by the tribal laws and the tribal standards and what we have going on our reservations, but we also are double whammied and have to abide by the state too. One instance is I pay utility taxes both to the state and to the tribe. And so I can see where the tribe is getting, where their budget goes for that and what their infrastructures are. But the states, I'm just absorbed in there. I just get double taxation. And so, those are some of the things that people don't realize that happen out there, that our laws and are different. And even to teach, recently, every about 6-7 years, South Dakota goes through a pattern of adopting standards. So they revisit every different content area standard on these systems. Well, in past history, the Oceti Essential Understandings was the only document that we had for South Dakota. And so as tribal education directors, we had talked to then the Department of Education Secretary Shop and kept asking her we need to mandate that because schools need to really take that and use that. And we will work to support that. The tribes will work to support that as one of the only documents. And if the teachers aren't well versed at it, then they can bring a Native person in and to help teach that subject. I mean, our non-Native teachers are expected to teach about the Holocaust, even if they're not involved in it. That was their expectation. And so, but one of the things that she talked about was we'll do that during the social studies content review. And so we really talked to her about that. But the Native community and other stakeholders really were invested in this. And so we kept putting it through the South Dakota legislature. And I think we did it 3 times so far, and really to mandate that all schools in a hopes of trying to get closer to Indian education for all, because that for all part is important to combat racism and bigotry, ignorance, those things. And if you can't get Indian education for all, we were trying to get as close as we could, but that didn't pass. 3 times it was shot down. And so the next step was the social studies revision committee by that time came up. And so there was a statewide call out for teachers and people that are interested in working on the work groups. And so I put my name, one of my staff other persons put their names in. Really in the work group, there was only 2 Native people in there. And we developed those standards. And one of the things that we were talked about, we were told directly not to use the word culture, not to use the word traditional, not to use any words like civics or anything that kind of mind. And then also definitely try to avoid key terms like perspectives. And so we were told that right up front. So we already knew that we were in trouble from the get-go. But we had a nice speech from the department secretary, and then off to work we went on these. And so really and when we got done with all of that, they one of the big things on the South Dakota standards is there's nothing in there reflective of Native American people, Indigenous people at all. And so we went ahead and embedded at least one standard per grade level, and more where it needed to have more. But at least one standard per grade level that talked about Ocheti Shakoi. And we left it as Ocheti Shakoi because we are the we are of the 7 council fires. And working together, that's a good term for the Great Plains areas here, specifically to South Dakota. And so we developed that, very proud of it, 100% consensus. And then at the end, finished it off, approved it, and shipped it off to the Department of Education. Well, we didn't see it for another couple more months, and the state had it, and it rolled out, and it was we knew things weren't going to be good when Friday or Thursday we got this notice that we all needed to get on a WebEx or a Zoom, and we got on there, and it was like this canned speech about 10 minutes. We're all talking, we're all excited to see each other and hear from each other, and here it was a canned speech, and it says, all right, standards will be released tomorrow. Thank you, click, done. So we didn't get a chance to ask anything or say anything. Then at noon the next day, the standards were released by 12:30 or 1 there. And it was rewritten. They were rewritten. All of that was taken out of it. Everything was just changed. The whole document was changed. And so there was a lot of pushback from our work group itself, and then pushback from the tribes. I don't know what else.
That's right. That's okay. We can. I have some follow-up questions for Sarah, and we'll come back again, Dr. Johnson. But thanks for those initial remarks. That really sets the stage for us. And Sarah, I'd like to just pose a question to you about the 1776 curriculum. You mentioned it briefly in your introduction, or somebody mentioned it briefly in their introductions. Could you talk a little bit about what that is in South Dakota? Why are they adopting it? Who's advocating for its adoption? And then in a meaningful way, does it address tribal history or culture in South Dakota?
And actually, this was a question that Ross actually touched on a little bit briefly in his introduction.
Sorry, Ross.
So I'm gonna defer this one to Ross for his answer on that.
Sorry, Ross, I got
You're going to put me on
mixed
the
up there, but
spot.
I turn it over to you then, Ross. Thanks.
I didn't get into the curriculum is basically to try to, as the name implements, it's to try to put history on the perspective of a more patriotic, in their view, guidance. It was a response to the BLM movement over the past summer in order to, I guess, from the political perspective, to get an upper hand on what's being taught, so that they felt that the statues and other things that were being taken down and the history that was going on, they were trying to pull back to say that they needed to, I hate to say the word re-educate, but educate people on what their perspective was, so that those statues don't become a target, but become part of a history that is more of a common history, and to get back to teaching, in their view, the traditional history of the United States as they saw it, which is based on the English perspective, and then the revolution and the manifest destiny and movement of the country that direction. And so the 1776 Commission was to kind of see how they can get that curriculum redrafted in the state school systems. And what you're seeing now is a little bit with the critical race theory that's out there. Those that support the 76 ideal see the critical race theory as an opposing versus critical thinking of looking at both sides of each situation for the historical perspectives. But that commission was very short-lived. It was towards the end of Trump's administration. And so this is where the governors are kind of jumping in, that are looking at the federal presidential politics, are trying to get in to show that they're going to follow the same trajectory as the Trump administration wanted to. So That's what I know of the 1776. Again, it was a short-lived, it's not very long, but that's where the governor, I believe, Noam is wanting to head in order to, as she puts it, get the state to understand its true history and diversify, using the word diversify to subjugate parts of history. And when she was trying to argue that, well, I believe it was actually Secretary Sanderson, and Dr. Johnson could probably correct me on this, was trying to argue that the reason why the Oceti Sakowin was not reduced, that was cited a lot more, but the content was reduced, was because they had to recognize the new groups that have come to South Dakota in an equal way, which wasn't the goal of the working group. And it was trying to use, again, the diversity argument against the groups that it's meant to protect, by saying we need to diversify and therefore reduce the native history that's there in South Dakota to as though it's an ethnic group that just happened to be there, of one of many ethnic groups. And that way we can go back to what we see as the history of South Dakota and want to march forward on. So I think that kind of addresses where the 1776 was, but that's what is driving the governor and her team, I believe, is to take up that mantle from the Trump administration.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Johnson.
The other thing I would want to add to it is Sarah's making comments in the side chat and stuff. You can read what those are. But yeah, our governor really did sign the pledge to save our schools, is what she calls it. But really, and all through the 1776 report, that talks a lot about equal and unequal, and then it's really states that it's against any kind of affirmative action. And so, it lays out a whole realm of thoughts, but it goes back to what's the truth. But, what the truth is where's our South Dakota Indigenous history? It's just not represented in there at all. Thank you.
Thanks. And Sarah, I'm going to come back to you now. So Dr. Johnson and Ross talked a bit about the sort of the power dynamics, the imbalance of power that's happened here. Is this dynamic similar to what you've experienced with the state of South Dakota on other issues related to education equity? And could you elaborate on those?
Yes, 110%. I think that one of Governor Noem's primary initiatives when she took office was she actually removed the Office of Indian Education out from the South Dakota Department of Ed, and she placed it under the Department of Tribal Relations, which to me was a clear indication that there was a desire to evade responsibility toward Indigenous education in our state. To further that, I mean, when she signed the pledge, and her justification was that teaching our grandchildren and children to hate their own country by pitting them against one another on the basis of race or sex is shameful and must be stopped. She wants to perpetuate the absent narrative, and the active erasure of our people. I think for some odd reason, I think she thinks for South Dakota having to face the reality of our history and acknowledge a perspective that isn't otherwise a part of the larger discussion in our classrooms somehow poses a threat to her. And so I think that's one of the clearest ways that we see it. Additionally, in our correspondence attempts as a coalition with members of the Department of Education, among others, and Governor Noem's cabinet, prove that we don't really have the authority or the seat at the table to even have these conversations, let alone make negotiations and have decision-making power to influence change in this realm. And that's why it's so important, as Dr. Johnson mentioned, because she's a tribal education director and she sits with the other education directors who do have the ultimate insight into what our students are needing across all 9 reservations in our state. And it's just really unfortunate that our voice has been disenfranchised from those tables. So I would say Governor Nome doesn't seem to express the spirit of inclusion, at least when it comes to tribal relations in South Dakota.
Thanks, Sarah. And Mary, coming to you, back to you, could you talk about how the absence of a tribally based curriculum affects public attitudes about issues that impact tribal nations and tribal people in the state of South Dakota and elsewhere?
I think if you think about, boarding schools in general, historically, that's what they did. Their whole purpose was to take away the language and the culture of Indigenous people to get them to assimilate, into the dominant culture. So, and I think that was something that was really painful, and and it continues today in the curriculum. And so I just think part of what we're trying to do, and it's a part of the healing process of that, is to add that back in. And Sarah and I both worked within a public school district to try and make change that way, and it was just like you run into walls all the time and you're told why you can't do that. So we're just taking on this and creating a school, and we know that this is going to work. We know that this will be really good for kids, that it will give them that strong cultural identity and a sense of belonging. I would like to share that my own grandsons attended a school where 75% of the population in a public school they attended were Indigenous students, but they did not feel like they belonged there. And it was really, like a cold, sterile setting. And with the onset of COVID, they had the opportunity, they were homeschooled, but in a little homeschool pod where they had this type of model where they got to see, they learned their language, they had elders come in and teach them lessons. And I would say within these cultural lessons that they learned, there are those standards that the state would like, things that all the kids should know, like these Common Core standards. So there is rigor in these lessons. And our students that were in the homeschool pod did like a 180, and they performed very well. They attended online classes in a tribal school on the reservation, and they did very, very well compared to their prior year. And they also tested well on standardized tests. So I just think it's important that people know that this type of educational model works. Teaching the language is another thing that helps increase scores on standardized tests. And I think, I just think the public really needs to be aware of that this is really important, and just the healing aspect of it, that, learning about who you come from is just so important to Indigenous students. And not only that, but it creates an awareness of all students of the impact that the Chetishakwe people had in this state. They walked first on this land, and there is still a lot of influence of the culture around today that I think a lot of people aren't aware of.
Thank you, Mary. Ross, would you be able to expand a little on any of those points that were Mary raised as a member of the South Dakota Education Equity Coalition for us? You're on mute. You're on mute, Ross.
I'm going to apologize. I got a text in the middle of that, so I didn't hear all of what Mary said. So
Okay.
I'm also in a hotel room and the maid walked in. So
Okay. The question of Mary was about the absence of a tribally based curriculum, and how does that affect public attitudes about the issues that impact tribal nations and tribal people in South Dakota and across the nation, and just some perspective that you might have on that as an education equity coalition member.
Well, I mean, obviously, if it's not in there, it creates a situation for politicians coming up through the system that don't have an understanding of the people they represent. And for the tribal citizens, it creates a narrative that doesn't fit with their background, and makes them feel marginalized and not to get involved in the process. And what you've seen over the years, and just in South Dakota, you can look at it, and I've seen this with other states, with the state tribal relationship. It's contentious because the education's not there. There's a lot of people coming into the system that just have no understanding of what tribal sovereignty is, what the history is, within their own state boundaries of how that came to, how reservations came to be, how the economies of those areas came to be. And what happens is that an elected official that's grown up in that education system without the knowledge starts assuming a lot of things about a group of people that are not accurate. And those assumptions are that the economy that comes from reservations is self-imposed, not something that's based on the trust land system and the other economic factors that have gone into it. They don't understand the treaty obligations and what that means. And they start thinking that reservations, again, are just economic disaster areas instead of political situations that were set up years ago. And then they don't want to work with it because they feel they have no responsibility by setting that up in their head. They think it's like an inner city. It's something that is self-induced, and that's completely wrong. And when they do understand the reality, when members of the SDEC sit down with legislators and stuff and go over and they start hearing the situation of how the community has been set up, how everything came to be, what sovereignty means, where the state government role is with the tribal government, with the federal government, all of a sudden they wake up to a little bit that this is not something that the tribes put themselves into. And this is not something that, is just because of a low income situation, that it's a political environment that was created by the United States government in the expansion. And I think if the history is to teach anything, it teaches both sides. It needs to have critical thinking so that people grow up and start debating policy based on the perspectives that are coming to it instead of based on assumptions. And right now, when you take those historical points out and you also then say you're not going to even talk about it, you're going to try to ban the teachers from even getting the kids to have critical thinking, you're going to create a generation that will be far worse than what we're seeing now of misunderstanding and tensions getting extremely high, because when you're not heard, you are really going to get angry. You're going to explode. And that's with any group. And what we saw with BLM over last summer was one of those, those examples. And again, it's the history that's not being taught. People just don't understand. So I think there's a lot of problems there that the legislators need to start addressing, because the environment that they're creating for the next generation is going to be solely on their shoulders. And I believe the governor needs to understand that very clearly, that, what she's pushing is a one race narrative. And that's not really that is not a direction to go. And you're seeing it in several states. I mean, I think Texas just had an issue on the Holocaust where a teacher felt like she had to bring in books to show other views of the Holocaust. When you start saying, well, if we're going to teach history, we're going to try to now rewrite it or show that there's an opposing view to it, that's not the case. It's not opposing views. There's views, but you're not rewriting it. And I think some of that's getting really convoluted here in a horrible way. And what they tried to do in South Dakota is very similar of, let's just, change the designation of the native people of the state to an ethnicity that is just one of several, with Somalis and other groups that are in the state, Czechs, and discount the actual fact that, South Dakota's history is part of the Oceti-Sakow's history, not the other way around. And I think that gets lost a lot.
Thanks. Thanks, Ross. Sarah, I want to ask you a question about community organizing and what strategies you have used or your colleagues have used to mobilize the tribal nations leadership within South Dakota and the Native community to sort of understand these obstacles, overcome these obstacles, take action.
Well, I think one of the first things I should preface with is that each and every one of us on the coalition are both parents or grandparents, or directly involved with the education system. I think one of the first initial steps that we took when we were promoting our school choice legislation in the early days of our coalition, it was really about wanting choice for our students and having those opportunities offered and readily available. But I think now, when I think specifically about this, the sentiments around the anti-CRT and Action Civics propaganda, in addition to the active erasure of our people from content and area standards, It one of the first things we do is engage the directors leading the charge on the ground, because we know we're not the only ones doing this work. In fact, there's a host of individuals doing it. But we started working closely with our tribal education directors because they're on the ground leading the charge for tribally based schools. And then we talked to other stakeholders in our urban areas across the state, because although we have 9 tribes that have geographic boundaries in South Dakota, in places such as Rapid City, which happens to be our 2nd largest city within our state, we are intertribal. In fact, in 2018, the last tribal student count we had was 69 different nations represented in Rapid City alone. And so being able to have the parents of all of the parents and the most vocal advocates in those spaces come together. So we have not only practitioners, but we have parents who are doing a lot of organizing. Actually, in response to the efforts that Dr. Johnson outlined so well with regard to the content standards, we actually convened all 9 tribes and held a march in Pierre, in our state capital, where we opposed those proposed standards in solidarity. And from there, there's just ongoing conversations, and there's an increased interest by members of our tribal councils who want to be more actively involved in this political process. And so it's really about that. Dr. Johnson does a really great job of relaying the information for the public to access public comment forms in response to those proposed standards and things like that. But a lot of it is just getting out into our communities and identifying those designated people who are looked to in those communities for leadership and guidance around these movements. And so that's kind of been the primary mode of that right now.
Okay. Thank you. And Mary, I wanted to come back. You talked a bit about student outcomes and how some students have realized benefits from parts of these curriculum and how it's showed up in other parts of their schoolwork. Ross, you talked a little bit about not just Indian students, but all students understanding this history because it has implications for how they see the world and the assumptions that they make. Mary, could you talk a little bit more about the impact that it's had on students from a perspective of belonging, perspective of health and wellness, and feeling like they're a part of the school system, part of the educational system, and it's a part of them too? Just sort of talk about those outcomes a little bit more.
Yeah. So this type of culturally responsive teaching is what it is. And one thing that I never got to talk about before too is like land-based learning, because Indigenous people are so connected to the land that, you know, a lot of the learning needs to happen out on the land, about the land. And I think it's just, that's another healing part for students, just to realize that connection they have to the land. It's very healing. Mm-hmm. I think when kids see themselves and what they're learning, first of all, it's very welcoming, because it's like what you see in your home. And when you see that in school and you get to see yourself in learning, I came from a district and it's the same district that I live in today, the school district. I'm a product of that. I never got to see myself hardly at all. A lot of what Dr. Sherry, just a few that Dr. Johnson talked about, a few of those spots, you know, where they talked about wars and stuff, we got to learn and see our people and what we were learning. But a lot of that was derogatory. You know, it wasn't in a good light. And that's painful. That's painful not to see yourself and what you're learning. And, you know, you only see the majority population in what you're learning. And when you get to see yourself and when you're learning, it first of all, you're more engaged, you're more excited, you're more motivated in what you were learning. And just feeling that ownership, you feel an ownership in your education, and it becomes relevant. It becomes relevant to your life. And I would say when you talk about the general population, because for my last 3 years in working in the district, I went across the district and modeled for teachers non-Indigenous teachers how to incorporate the Oceti Shakwe essential understandings into their lessons. And not just social studies, where I think a lot of people think they live, but there are literacy lessons, there are math lessons, there are science lessons that you can incorporate these in. And when I would go out there and teach these lessons, I mean, first of all, I noticed the excitement in our Indigenous students' eyes and their engagement when they got to see and hear, you know, about themselves and what they were learning. But also it was very good for non-Native students to learn about, you know, these things, and they would be very engaged as well. And I think when you get to see and learn about the good, the bad, and the ugly part of history, that it makes you a well-rounded thinker. And not only that, this type of culturally responsive teaching also helps develop your critical thinking and problem-solving skills. And then also, you know, you start thinking about social justice issues and how you can improve those. So those are all the benefits of teaching culturally responsive teaching, the Oceti Shakwe essential understandings. There are 7 of them, and just getting to learn all of those is helps improve. You have improved academic outcomes, but also that's a quantitative measure, but a qualitative measure would be just that real strong sense of belonging and strong sense of cultural identity, which will help you in so many things to be successful in life.
Thanks, Mary. And Dr. Johnson, I'm going to come back to you before we open up to the larger audience for questions. Could you just summarize, in your words, why it's important for South Dakotans to understand tribal history and culture in your state and other states? And could you also touch a little bit on Title VI and provide us with a little bit of information on what that is and how this drives the work and why it's important?
Okay. Thank you. I will just continue on with what Mary was really stating, because she stated it really eloquently, and when she talked about the culturally responsive teaching and what that brings to us. Because again, I would say, that sense of belonging, the improved education, and at one of my last meetings, somebody had a story about asking how many students had a grandpa and a grandma, and there was a few kids that put their hands up, and then in this predominantly Native American classroom asked, well, who has an unchi or okana or kushi, and then all the hands up went. And so those are terms, and that teacher brought in that sense of belonging when she said that. Because when our kids are little, they don't understand all those things. And why is it important is the more education we have, the more understanding we have, the more understanding of different cultures, different ways of people, and that acceptance comes, that we are all of one people, that we have acceptances but we have our own unique differences. And that's where education needs to teach all those little differences, so you're respectful of those cultural, those differences in cultural belief systems. I mean, everybody has those little unspoken rules within your family, and so it brings you back to that family. Why is it important? So students see themselves. Those tribal schools are very important, and even the school in Rapid City, because they see themselves in the teachers. They see that face reflected into them. And so it's real helpful. It's the only way that we're gonna combat that racism and combat all those different stereotypical ideals that go about is through education. And the whole reason to teach history, and you hear it time and time again, so we don't repeat the past, the wrongs of the past. It's not about making a whole race of people feel bad about what they did, and that's a big they, but it's not about making them feel bad about it. It's not about making little children feel bad about the atrocities that we've lived for, but it's there to know that that happened and we can change it and be different for our future. We need to understand who we are, what we're about, and provide that understanding for children and that acceptance of all races, rather than trying to hide. And as a Native American sitting in the last row and putting my head down and saying, teacher, don't call on me. Don't point out that I'm Native. Don't, it's just because, as a little kid, when I first found out I was a Native, I was an Indian, I sat there and bawled because I didn't know differently. I know I'm not, because all I saw was Indians and cowboys shooting each other. So, and Indians were always scalping and being the bad ones. So, I have to think about those things and how that shaped who I am. And we need to help shape our little minds so they're accepting of all people. Did I answer your question in the middle?
Oh, thanks. If you would, can you? We put a link to Title VI in the chat for folks to have a reference for that. If you could just briefly give us a little bit of an overview of what Title VI is and why it's important to this issue.
So all of our titles, why it's important is in the federal law, in the ESSA law, the Elementary Education and Secondary Act. That's where it lays out that tribal consultation is required, that you are to consult with Indian tribes that are within your area, and they lay out the specifics of if you have more than 40, have a budget in any of your title programs of more than 40,000, or have this many % of students and that qualify under that, then you are required to do that. And all of our titles from our Title I, which formerly used to be Chapter 1 and everything, but that's to offset the disadvantages of children. And so all of our titles have a purpose such as that. Title I is our most important because that brings our most money into our Title I schools. And that's just to alleviate the disparities of children and help school systems. And for most part, they use it for staffing. A lot of teachers come out of that, paraeducators and teachers come out of that funding. And so all the titles, there's rural, there's Title IV, that's professional development. And then when you get all the way up to the impact aid, and that is your most, I think it's been the one that's been there the longest, but it has so very little change, your Title VI in your Indian education program. So you're actually buying, and I can remember the year when they changed it from we used to use it for just pure funding Native American programs, and then all of a sudden it changed that it had to have ties into academics. So if you used it for a native language teacher, you had to tie it back to how that improves math and reading. And so all your title programs are like that for some reason. So our Indian education program, and they can use that for just about anything for improvement. Most schools will use it for title aids, they call them, or school improvement liaisons. They use it a lot for attendance. Impact aid, it's dealing with the loss of land, tax-based revenue. And our point blank, our biggest school system says, if it wasn't for the impact aid funding, we get a lot more from impact aid than if we had our natives on the population for tax basis. We get a lot more. And so, they acknowledge that and respect that. And so that's what impact aid does, is it helps balance when you're living on trust land and you don't pay those land taxes. So that's what the impact aid offsets that.
Thanks very much. I don't know where that feedback came from, but thanks very much. I'm going to open the floor up to some general questions for the panelists from our audience. I'm not able to, Catherine, if you wouldn't mind changing the view or keeping an eye on people raising their hands. So if you have questions of the panelists, please raise your hand or place them in the chat or speak up. So Now I've got all of them, everybody here. So are there any questions for the panelists?
Fred, I see one question here. It
Okay.
says, do you think that the generational perspectives for younger non-natives is currently racist too for people under 30? And in what ways can younger non-native generations help change the narrative as allies? And I guess that's to whomever wants to answer it.
So would you like me to repeat that, panel? So do you think the generational perspectives for younger North Dakota non-natives is currently racist? Two, for those under 30, in what ways can younger non-native generations help change the narrative as allies?
So I'll answer part of that or some of it. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so that said, I think that younger people, and when they're non-Indians, and I give you that example because there's sometimes as a Native person that I can say something, but it doesn't mean as much as a non-Native would say it. And, I hate to say it like that, but it's the truth. And, these happen to do with a lot of things. And, even to the point where I'll throw my education out there because that'll automatically validate who I am rather than anything else validating who I am. And then as far as being that, how did you say it? Ally to, I have to take it back to our work group because out of all of our work group, remember I said there was just 2 Native Americans on there. And out of all of our work group, we had a full allies of teachers saying, this is what best our children should learn. And so they could speak out. And at that point in time, a lot of them would ask me questions privately. How does this sound? Do you think does this sound offensive? And, they finally felt able to speak freely and ask those questions that are, just ignorance. We have 2 school districts, a public school district and a tribal school districts. And a lot of times our teachers will retire out of our public school system, but because they're still not really ready for retirement, they will jump into teaching at the tribal school. And 9 times out of 10, they'll say, I never knew that. I've lived here my entire life and I never knew that. And it'd be just general things about this area, about the culture, maybe the history of our area from a Native American perspective. And so, oh yeah, we definitely need allies in all parts because there's some doors that'll automatically open by skin color. And I hate to say that, but North Dakota has taken a big stance when they changed the Senate bill, they passed their Senate bill. And so to actually add the laws of mandates of teaching right into their laws, that's huge. And I have to applaud North Dakota for doing that because everybody around South Dakota is doing something except for us. So we got Minnesota, we've got North Dakota, we got Montana with its Indian Education for All. That's how they're dealing with racism and ignorance, is they're teaching Indian education for all across the board and teaching it so it's not, so it doesn't make other kids feel bad. So it's not a reversed racism also. So, well, I started it, somebody else can finish.
Mary Ross or Sarah, any follow-up to Dr. Johnson's comments before we move to another question?
I'd like to reinforce and echo her sentiments with, I think the thing about understanding one's role as an ally is really not to superimpose your experience on that. And I think that's a lot of what Dr. Johnson talked about in being authentic to who she is gives her more credibility in those spaces. I think having someone younger whose desire is to come into this space with a genuine curiosity also lends itself to more allyship and accomplishment than anything else. I do also want to say that we do have several allies and accomplices as part of our South Dakota Education Equity Coalition, and we know that their role on the coalition is so invaluable, and they're able to occupy spaces and sometimes influence stakeholders a little easier than we are in our current role, due to the lack of narrative there. I want to also go back to Ross was talking about some of the issues with Governor Noem and how her lack of understanding of tribal sovereignty, as evidenced by her multiple violations of tribal sovereignty in her tenure, really reinforces the fact that we really need inclusive education opportunities here. But I think that some of our team just got back from the National Indian Ed Association conference last year, and we're not alone in this. I think there were a lot of different stakeholders who have a desire to jump on this inclusionary effort as well. And just to go off of a sentiment I see in the chat about the desire for Montana to be fulfilling Indian Ed for all, we see that with mandates. That, you know, with mandates, when you mandate something, it can kind of taint it. But what we're learning is when we start evaluating stats across the board, Oregon has the highest performance rate for Indigenous students, and they actually have mandated the inclusion of their Indigenous language and culture into their curriculum, but their test scores are just amazing in comparison. And sorry, that was tangential.
Okay. Any other comments from Mary or Ross, just to follow up on that before we move to another? We're reaching the last 5 minutes or so of our webinar.
I guess as the non-native, maybe I should give a little what I see with kids. I mean, to be honest, I think the generation coming up is a little bit more broad-minded just because of social media and other avenues that they're getting their information from. I think the best way to engage, though, is it's that personal connection that has to come in. And unfortunately, what you see with politics these days and with the families that they grow up in, everything's become hyper partisan on everything. And that means everything the kids are even taught is being taught through what the parents perceive as a partisan lens of which way they're going. And you'll see young kids going into college with preconceived notions because they've already started to align with the groups they're in. I think the best way for those non-natives to get involved and help with their fellow non-natives understand things is to somehow have them connect with the communities that they want to learn, you know, they need to understand, to meet those people, to understand that just because they're maybe on a different side of the political aisle, that doesn't make them an opponent. It makes it an opportunity to discuss policy and actually learn about different backgrounds and different opportunities. And that's really hard to do in today's world because everything is so hyper partisan. And I think, you know, especially in the Dakotas, where you have stores that sell just paraphernalia of a president's name and nothing that sits there and discusses the policy. And the kids grow up thinking that they need to wear that label in order to be in the in crowd. And then you have a governor who, and I'm not going to say Governor Noem doesn't know about tribal sovereignty. She knows very well what tribal sovereignty is. She served in Congress, and she knows exactly the federal role with the tribes and those policies. She chooses to go against the tribes. And I think that needs to be very clear. This is not an educational thing with the governor. This is a purposeful situation with the governor. It's economics, it's political money that she gets. It's not ignorance. The problem is she's teaching ignorance. And she's telling the people that follow her path that this is your opponents, instead of teaching that it's not an opponent, as was stated before. It's a shared culture, it's shared opportunities, and the kids need to learn that. But I think there is a little bit of hope that you are seeing through social media, different avenues to get in there where the kids can see stuff And I know there's a lot of stuff out there. I watch it because I watch what my daughter's seeing, but you've got great stuff going on TikTok and everything else where people are sharing their cultures, sharing their backgrounds. You had social distance powwow during the pandemic. I think that's still going on. I think you have a lot of kids that have tuned into that to see what that's about, that never even thought about it, didn't understand it. They're asking questions and they're finding it interesting. And I think that's how you start breaking down the barriers while the state like North Dakota passes good stuff. Hopefully we can see the same with South Dakota where South Dakota seems to want to be last in everything, but hopefully we can get them to start stepping up to at least start following what their neighboring states are doing.
Thanks, Ross. And Mary, one last comment from you, if that's okay.
I would just say that I agree with everything that they said. I think that social media is a good platform to learn a lot of things. And I would say too, with this last administration, that really made race relations tough. There's a lot of high tension there. But yeah, I have a lot of hope for this younger generation.
Thanks, Mary. And Jack, we've got about 3 minutes left in our presentation here. I'd like to turn it back over to you and Michelle Fox to sort of wrap it up for us.
Okay, well, I want to thank Fred and all the panelists for a very engaging conversation. I hope that everybody who was able to attend learned something and you can bring something away from this that will be both educational, but something you can use in when you go back to what you're doing after this webinar. And I want to thank Fred for being willing to step forward and moderate the panel. Fred, thank you for coming back to KC and making your reappearance and serving as a moderator for this panel. I want to thank NDN for pulling together these panelists. I want to thank Dr. Sherry Johnson, who I've known for a lot of years, for being willing to step up and become a part of this panel as well. So with that, Michelle, do you have any, and I will say that this has been recorded. So if there's any part you want to go back and see, or if you have a colleague that wasn't able to attend that may want to see this, it is available, and just you can contact a CC who is on here, or contact me or Michelle or Robbie, whomever. We'll make sure that it gets to you if you need the link. Michelle, any final thoughts?
I'd just like to thank the education equity team at NDN for, they did an outstanding job on this panel. Very informational. I know they've done a lot of hard work in this space. So definitely very appreciative of them, as well as the KC team and also Fred. And this will probably be the last time you guys see me on these panels because I am leaving NDN in a couple of weeks. So it was great to work with all of you. And I will see you later on down the road.
Thank you, Michelle, for all your contributions to really putting this together and moving it forward in a meaningful way. It's been a pleasure to work with you.
We have a virtual hand clap for all of our panelists. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, with that, thank you everybody for attending, and there'll be another webinar with NBN for the tribal folks. So keep your eyes open for it, and you will hear from us soon.